This is going to be quite brief, and I hope odd enough to wake you up, because I thought since you have been through a relatively tough winter one more time, and it has been so gray here, this gray bowl of sky that we can get here in Southwest Michigan, that bothers me in my head, in my thoughts, more than the cold. I don't mind the snow, and the cold I can stay away from in my warm house. We're all happy to have our warm houses. But that gray bowl of sky gets to me. And if only the sky were the color of my friend's hair, the man in this chair back there. Derek with his wife Joanna own the Book Bug, and I want to remind all of us that when we need a book, we should come to a public library. And if we like the book enough, we should march right over to the Book Bug and get it. Independent bookstores are so important to this world. They give us so much more than the books. There are always people there who love books like we do. And so please, whenever you have the need, remember the Book Bug. He's here tonight, and he has some of the books I've written. There's a famous person here, and he happens to be the man who's illustrated all of my books, plus 50 other books for people from all over the world. His name is David Small, and I am honored to be his wife, to say the least. He encourages my gardening. He encourages me, and he encourages my writing life. So here we go. How many of you are already planning your garden for this year? How many of you have had a garden in the past? How many of you have helped someone else, a friend or anyone else, in a garden in the past? I too, that's more mine. I have a feeling that in the room, even though there are just a few of us, you all know more than I do about this kind of gardening. This just your everyday, wonderful garden. Oftentimes it's a vegetable garden, or it's just a garden that's so full of flowers it breaks your heart. It's so beautiful at certain moments during the growing season. Now there is a person here who doesn't know much about any of the things you know about, and he is my husband sitting back there, and I don't know about Derek, but I think some of you know about seeds and how deep to plant them. You don't plant some seeds deeply at all. Others you really have to mash down into the soil. Some of you probably know the best cucumbers to plant for a certain kind of pickle. I know nothing about that. And what else is it that some of you would know that I don't know? Oh, it's things like when to plant the squash. I'm always ambivalent about that, because if you wait long enough, you avoid a lot of the bugs. Anyway, my point to you is that I know a lot about that kind of thing, but I know more about the Latin names of all the plants, because that's my interest, Latin. And I know a whole lot about native plants, because they're my favorite plants now. And I have this meadow next to our house that most people in our area call a patch of weeds, and I don't care, because it's not a patch of weeds. This is rosemary from my rosemary bush. Oh, that's not a pretty one. Oh, there's a great big one. And so, I'll give you. And so I know a lot about Latin names, and I know a lot about native plants, and I know a lot about orchard trees and fruit-bearing shrubs, because that's what I love. But for about 20 minutes maybe, I have a clock, so I'm not going to run over, because I don't think we should stay here very long. I don't know what you have to do, but in spring I always have a lot to do, and I also haven't had any supper. I want to talk about two things with regard to our gardening lives. I want to talk about beauty on the one hand and sustainability on the other. Not too long about the sustainability because it's clean and sharp and easy to talk about and we all understand it. But beauty is complicated. I want you to know what everybody knows but we don't think about so much. It is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, always, always, always. And therefore, you may have any kind of garden you please. It doesn't matter if your neighbors disapprove. It doesn't matter if it's very different from anything else you've ever done before and you want to experiment. It doesn't matter if it's the same thing you've done every year and you're going to keep doing it. That's who I am pretty much, a traditionalist. It doesn't matter. The garden should be yours. And what I find interesting is, with regard to this concept of beauty, I have three comparisons to make. Small is beautiful in terms of gardens, and big to huge is beautiful. It doesn't matter, and anything in between. I have a friend who is a special education teacher of the first merit, 5-star first education teacher, special education teacher. And she has a tiny little garden that is, if this were a square, it's about this big. And this square in front of her tiny cottage that's about 750, 800 square feet is made up into squares. And she has an amazing amount of vegetables and a few flowers in there. And she just plants in the squares, starting with a dome that comes out of the middle square, which is a tomato plant, and it's a cherry tomato plant, so it has a gazillion tomatoes, and that's what she always starts with. And then she has cucumbers on smaller domes around that, and they go out and up. And then she plants a lot of greens for her salads. And she doesn't have much more except that she sticks flowers in there at the points of where the squares meet. And it is adorable. It looks like garden elves made it. And it's just right for her tiny little house. It's on the south side, but it's in a place that the little house, in a way, the little house kind of has an arm around. So it's protected, but it gets a lot of sun. On the other hand, her name is Suzette Kingman. On the other hand, a young Amish friend and her parents, she's never married, this young Amish friend and her parents have a huge garden behind their small farmhouse. It's massive. It looks like they must have 15 people working in it, but they don't, of course. It's just the three of them, and her parents are getting older, and so she does most of it. Delilah Miller, Amos and Lydia May's grown daughter, Delilah, who is also a teacher. I hadn't thought about that connection. And it's rows and rows and rows and rows. It's probably 4 times this room. It's massive. And on this side, on this border, there are chickens and goats, manure, of course. And on this side, there are grapes. And not the buggy horse, but another horse, a Morgan, goes through on those furrows. Not yet, but in 2 or 3 weeks, and tidies them up and opens them up. And she walks behind that horse now. Anyway, they are both beautiful, totally different, but beauty in the large and in the small and everything in between. And I think that's important to think about with regard to gardening. Secondly, the formal versus the informal is very interesting in terms of gardening and beauty. I'm going to use myself as the example for the formal. My husband, David Small, and I live in an historic home that's on the National Register. It's an extremely primitive Greek Revival house. So just this neoclassical rectangle. It's just white painted boards on the land. But because it's neoclassical and it was built before Michigan was a state in the 1830s, it has a certain formality to it, even though there's nothing formal about it when you look at it. It's so plain, but it has formal elegance in its lines. And so across the road where we own a little strip of land that's shaped like this, it was a barn lot, and here's a barn and my garden shed and a little granary and another fence that cuts the barn lot into 2/3 and 1/3. And this 2/3 is about, I'm embarrassed to say, almost 2 acres. It's much, 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 much too big, but I don't care, I love it. David says I paint with a large brush. And so in this garden, because I wanted it to reflect the Greek Revival home, I have parterres. I have paths and shapes of beds. And everything I plant is in a pattern. And I started it by going out and putting stake and string, stake and twine, from the gate, which is in the middle of the garden. Now, it was in the middle of the space then. It was just soil out there, and corn had been planted for years. So stake and twine across to the corner, and then from the opposite corner to across from the gate, and then an X. And I made those triangular shapes, and an Amish friend and I, Ermachine Yoder and I, cut those shapes out a few at a time. We started with 8 small beds and a central bed and moved out over the years. And so now it's a pattern. It's a patterning of shapes on the land, and it has its calm, safe beauty in its formality that I really feel comfortable in. It's too much for me now. It's too big, but I don't care. I just go out there and work away, and there are more weeds every year, and I'm trying to mulch more every year, and I'm working it out. So that's formal. Informal, I think at its height, can be absolutely glorious. It can be any kind of a garden. I had a godmother, Victoria Litna, who lived here in Kalamazoo and was famous for her eccentric ways as well as for her extraordinary watercolors and her portraits. And Victoria lived in a tiny house on Lovell or Monroe, running along beside Kalamazoo College. And in her front yard, think of this if you want to be, if you want to just burst out and do something different with regard to beauty. The opposite of my beauty, my formality in that garden I have, she just filled up the yard with everything. People gave her seeds, and she bought seeds when she liked the picture on the, on the envelope, and the birds brought her seeds, and I'm sure she planted some things to paint. And so she had sunflowers, and then she had all these messy geraniums that were hanging over and spilling, and then nasturtiums, and it was the weirdest. She had marigolds that somebody had given her that looked odd until what had she put? She stuck a stake, and it wasn't a tomato plant. It wasn't a cute. She had a melon plant. I couldn't think for a minute. She had a melon plant coming up on a teepee with nasturtiums and marigolds and zinnias and just stuff just all over the place. And the sunflowers were hanging over the curb. It was just beautiful, wasn't it, darling? And funny, and it made people smile. It was like a group of children had been given a whole bunch of seeds in a basket. Each had been given a basket with seeds, and they had just been playing a game while throwing the seeds around, and then everything had grown. It was just wonderful, and she did that for years. And that's the opposite of what I've done. I'm not even sure I'm sure she had to water it. I was going to say she didn't water it, but of course she watered it. It was so magical, if you can imagine how strange it was. I mean, it was her front yard, but it was so magical. I think that's why I started to say she didn't water it. Of course she watered it. So that's formal and informal. And then, so we have beauty, as I said, in small and large, in formal and informal. And then, what else did I want to say? Oh, sun and shade. Now, if we're really interested in vegetables, we don't want to talk about shade. But I just want to say in terms of beauty that I have been surprised over the years many times by shade gardens. And one in particular, because it was so small and because a man had done it, the late Marty Maddox, who also was a Kalamazoo artist like Victoria Litton, my godmother. Marty was the artist here. He made his living with his art. But it was just a little space some of you might have between a big high fence where on the other side of the fence was some ugly used car lot or something on Main Street. It was really ugly on the other side of the fence, but it was high. And then their little house, their tiny little house. And here was this dark area that wasn't much bigger than this space right here coming out the door over to the first orange chair. And he had a little serpentine path. He had a small bench. There were trees that he had trimmed up. And then he just had primroses of every color in the rainbow. And he had found and they were just tucked in ribbon-like. And then he had variegated everything. I think anytime he went, well, because he was Marty, I'm sure he shopped for these things because he was an elegant guy. But every time he went to a garden center, I'm sure he asked for things with sharp white variegated leaves. So what I wanted to say was, this was a dark, ugly space. Nobody noticed. We just went into his little house until he did this. Do you remember that, darling? It was tiny. You walked right through it in half a minute, but it was heart-stoppingly beautiful. And he made that in the shade with the sharp white variegated leaves of obviously hostas, but other things too, the names of which I don't know. On the other hand, if the sun is beating down all the time, really hot sun, endless sun, like Edna Dickinson's garden. This is another artist I had not thought about. Edna Dickinson is a ceramist, and she lives in San Miguel de Allende, where we live in the winters, because it's cheap, because it's warm, and because I can write all day long. Anyway, in San Miguel de Allende lives Edna Dickinson across the cobblestone street from us, up on the side of the mountain. And she has the sun beating down. We're very near the equator. We're thousands of feet up, more than a mile up. And so she has, because Mexico has people who work with stones like they breathe, like they brush their teeth. So she has stone walls built up, and paths are stone too. In between, the stone walls are this high, and they're filled with soil, so things are going to be happy and thrive. And in them, she put all the ground covers she could find anywhere. She has as many ground covers as she could find. That's all she did, because the sun is going to bake a flower garden or the vegetables. And so she just has a few vegetables tucked over here and an occasional big, blousy flower blooming in this bed. But mostly it's this lovely, flowing, big space It's about half this room and not as long, filled with these ground covers most people don't think anything about, but she's made them objects of art because there are so many of them and because they are framed, because they're framed in the stones. It's just beautiful. And the plants that are blooming aren't blooming at the same time. So she has a shrub blooming over here and even a rose spilling over the wall over here. It's oddly and unexpectedly beautiful, and the sun is just relentless. But it doesn't matter. I think most of the ground covers would be living even if her gardener didn't water. And lastly, with regard to beauty, I wanted to say that in the great gardens, you can put, you can see it. You can see the vegetables with the flowers, with the herbs, with the orchard trees, and the little berry shrubs, the shrubs that make the blueberries and the red raspberries. You can see all of those together in perfect harmony with the great gardeners. I knew one, her name was Lydia Grace Finch Rawson, Lydia Rawson. I wrote a book called The Gardener for her. She was extraordinary. Her garden, her land around King Mill outside of Leonidas, Michigan, had all of that growing everywhere. Everything together in harmony. The beauty was, it was beyond description. And George Washington did that at Mount Vernon. He has everything there to this day for us to look at. It's just in different spaces, but all the families are together. They're all happy together, unlike our world today. They're different kinds of plants together. So that's beauty at its ultimate. And now, because it's 7, I will say 3 minutes worth of words about sustainability. I hope I said something interesting about beauty. I think I went on a little too long, but in your garden, you are going to have, no matter whether you have a flower garden or vegetables and herbs or berries or all of that, like I do, you are going to be sustained by that garden. Not just in the obvious way of being fed by it and the beauty you get from it, but you yourself are going to be sustained in the sense of the origin of the word, held from below, lifted up, encouraged, because you're going to be exercising. You're not just going to be eating the food and lifted up by the beauty of the flowers. You're going to be exercising, and so you are going to be sustained in all manner of ways at all levels by the garden. And if you turn that around, if you care enough about the earth to even think of planting a garden to begin with, and you are respectful of the earth in a sufficiency, if you're respectful of the earth to the degree that you have a compost pile, that you don't use too much water, that you mulch and protect, that you bring others over to see what you're doing, that you don't use strong chemicals. If you are doing all of that, then in subtle ways, every day, you're extending the life of Mother Earth in your small way. You really are. You're helping to sustain Mother Earth if you're a gardener. And we need to think about the power of that if we can just be a model for others and get others to come along with us and do the same thing. We are in terrible trouble on this earth and in this extraordinary world of ours. And I do think that gardening is healing in many, many ways. And the two I have wanted to talk about and tried to make sense about, the two areas I think have power are those areas I've mentioned, of beauty on the one hand and sustainability on the other. So I would like to close with a poem, which probably half of the people in the room already have read. I don't read very many living writers. I read mostly the old guys. But in this case, I make an exception. I've read everything Mary Oliver has ever written. The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? I'm reading a poem and I'll start over for you. It's lovely to see you. It's called The Summer Day, and it's by a poet I admire named Mary Oliver. This is Richard. I've had him since I was your age. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass. The one who is eating sugar out of my hand. The one who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down. Who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Thank you so much.